I've spent 20 years of my life staring at lines on a page, arguing about inches of topsoil and the precise arc of a property boundary in stuffy courtrooms. So you'd think I'd know a thing or two about where a man's rights end and the world begins. My name's Silas Thorne, and after 2 decades of being a forensic surveyor, the kind of guy people hire when they're ready to sue their neighbor over a misplaced fence, I was done with the noise, done with the glass towers, and frankly, done with people. I took my savings, bought 180 acres of sun-baked, sage-crusted land out past Red Creek, and figured the only neighbors I'd have to negotiate with would be the coyotes and the occasional stray steer. The deed said, in quote, unincorporated county land, end quote, which to me sounded like a love letter from the universe, a promise that no one was going to tell me what color to paint my shed or how high my grass could grow. I was living out a vintage Airstream while I fixed up the old limestone ranch house, drinking my coffee black and listening to the wind rattle the windmill, feeling like I'd finally won the game of life. But then came the morning that changed everything. The morning a pristine white Lexus SUV pulled up to my cattle gate like a pearl dropped in a dust bowl. A man hopped out, one of those guys who wears a dry-clean polo shirt in 90-degree heat, and he didn't in Oppos to even have the decency to wave. He just stood there with a clipboard, looking at my weathered barn like it was a stain on a silk tie. When I walked down to the gate, grease on my hands and a scowl on my face, he didn't in Oppos to introduce himself. He just looked at his papers and told me that if I didn't in Oppos to settle my, in quote, outstanding association dues, in quote, by Friday, the board would move for a forced lien and eventual eviction. I actually laughed, the kind of dry, raspy laugh that comes from a man who has an end Oppos. He's spoken to another human in 3 days, and I told him he was either lost or delusional because this land was older than his subdivided, in quote, community, in quote, by a good 50 years. I remember looking past him toward that SUV, and through the tinted glass, I saw her, Cassandra Sterling, the self-appointed queen of the High Ridge HOA, just sitting there staring at me through designer sunglasses like I was a bug she was planning to step on. She didn't end Oppos say a word, just lifted a camera, snapped a picture of my face, and they drove off, leaving me standing in a cloud of caliche dust with a pit forming in my stomach that told me mine, quote, unincorporated, in quote, slice of heaven was about to become a battlefield. I spent that evening hunched over my kitchen table, going through my closing documents for the 100th time, tracing the legal description with a trembling finger. Parcel 42B, Section 12, Rural Reclamation Zone. It was all there, black and white, no mention of High Ridge, no mention of an HOA, and certainly no mention of the $3,000, in quote, initiation fee, in quote, they were suddenly demanding. I tried to tell myself it was just a bureaucratic hiccup, a clerical error from a group of bored suburbanites who'd spent too much time policing the height of mailboxes. But deep down, as a surveyor, I knew better. I'd seen this movie before, where developers get greedy and start looking at the vacant land on their borders like it's a buffet they Haven and Oppos been invited to yet. I woke up the next morning to the sound of a drone, a high-pitched, mosquito-like buzz that seemed to follow me from the barn to the pond. And when I looked up and saw that silver speck hovering right over my private workshop, I knew the polite phase of this disagreement was officially over. A few days later, the, end quote, welcome pack, end quote, arrived, though calling it that is like calling a ransom note an invitation to dinner. It was a 3-inch thick binder filled with, end quote, revised jurisdictional maps, end quote, and a list of violations that made my head spin, unapproved livestock, non-compliant fencing, and my personal favorite, in quote, excessive visual clutter, in quote, caused by my solar array. They'd even included a photocopied map where a new, shaky line had been drawn right over my property, effectively, in quote, annexing, in quote, my southern 60 acres into their district. I didn't in Oppos waste time calling their office. I went straight to an old friend of mine, a woman named Elena Vance, who had been a shark of a real estate attorney back in the city before she moved out here to raise horses. Elena looked at the binder, then at my deed, and then she let out a long, low whistle that made my hair stand on end. She told me that on paper they were committing a dozen flavors of fraud, but in a small county like this, if they had the right people in the records office on their payroll, they could make my life a living hell before a judge ever saw the truth. She told me to keep my head down and document everything, but I told her that I didn't and oppose. T buy 180 acres of freedom just to keep my head down, so I decided to play their game. Only I was going to change the rules. I started noticing and survey stakes and appearing near my pond. Cheap wooden sticks with orange ribbons that were definitely not mine, and every time I pulled one out, a new one would appear the next morning. It was a psychological war, a slow-motion invasion by people who thought that because they had manicured lawns and LinkedIn profiles, they could just colonize the dirt I bled for. Then came the night of the storm, a real Texas gully washer that turned my driveway into a river of red mud, and through the lightning flashes, I saw headlights. I crept out to the porch with my old Remington, not because I wanted to use it, but because out here you don and oppose. T answer a midnight knock with a smile, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. It was a crew of 3 men in yellow vests, led by Cassandra's son, a kid named Marcus who had more arrogance than sense, and they were busy unloading a backhoe from a trailer right at the edge of my southern pasture. They weren't and oppose, T just surveying anymore. They were preparing to break ground on what they called community drainage project, which was really just a fancy way of saying they wanted to turn my best grazing land into a runoff pit for their golf course. I stepped out into the rain, the flashlight beam cutting through the downpour like a knife, and I shouted over the thunder for them to get the hell off my land before I called the sheriff. Marcus didn't and oppose. T even looked scared. He just smirked and held up a laminated work order signed by the county clerk, telling me that under the Emergency Infrastructure Act they had the right to stabilize the border. I stood there, rain soaking through my shirt, watching them trample the native grasses I'd spent months protecting, and I realized that the law was and oppose. They're going to save me. Not yet, anyway, because they had already poisoned the well. I retreated back to the house, but I didn't and oppose. T go to bed. I went to my office and pulled out the one thing they didn't and oppose. T know I had the original hand-inked topographical surveys for 1952, along with a high-grade GPS transponder I'd kept for my working days. If they wanted to play with maps, I was going to give them a lesson in cartography they'd never forget. The next morning, I did something a little unconventional. I knew they were watching me with that drone, and I knew they were waiting for me to leave for town so they could start digging, so I made a show of loading up my truck and driving away. But I didn't and oppose. T go to town. I circled back through the brush on my ATV and hid in the tree lean with a long lens camera. Sure enough, 30 minutes later, the backhoe roared to life, and they started tearing into the earth, right where I'd planted a set of decoy stakes the night before. You see, being a surveyor means you know how people look at the land. They look for the markers, not the dirt itself. And I had led them right into a trap. About 6 feet down, the backhoe bucket hit something solid with a sickening clang, and I watched through the lens as Marcus and his crew hopped down into the pit, looking confused. They'd hit a buried concrete vault, one I'd carefully uncovered and then reconcealed weeks earlier when I was exploring the old well sites on the property. What they didn't oppose, T know, was that this wasn't an oppose. T just any vault. It was a decommissioned monitoring station for a protected underground aquifer, a site that was under federal jurisdiction, not county. By the time I called the State Department of Environmental Quality and the Federal Water Bureau, Marcus and his crew were already knee-deep in a mess they couldn't and oppose. T bribed their way out of. I walked down to the pit, my camera still clicking away, and I'll never forget the look on Cassandra Sterling's face when she pulled up in her Lexus 10 minutes later to see her son being questioned by a federal agent I'd had on speed dial for my surveying days. I didn't and oppose. TL, I didn't and oppose. T gloat. I just leaned against my truck and told her that unincorporated land meant the rules were a lot bigger than her little HOA board meetings. It turned out that by breaking ground on a protected site without federal permits they couldn't and oppose. T get because they didn't and oppose. T actually owned the land. They'd trigger a mandatory audit of every boundary adjustment the High Ridge HOA had made in the last 5 years. The fallout was like a landslide. Once the feds started digging, They found a paper trail leading straight from Cassandra's office to a crooked clerk in the county records building who had been, in quote, adjusting, in quote, maps in exchange for kickbacks on development deals. It wasn't Oppo's. Just my 60 acres. They've been nibbling away at half a dozen elderly landowners in the area, stealing bits of Texas 1, in quote, clerical error, in quote, at a time. Cassandra lost her house, her reputation, and eventually her freedom when the racketeering charges dropped, and Marcus ended up doing 6 months of community service. Ironically, cleaning up the very drainage ditches he'd tried to illegally dig on my land. Now, the silence out here is real again. The only drone I hear is the sound of the dragonflies over the pond, and the only lines I care about are the ones the sunset draws across the horizon every evening. People tell me I was lucky, but I tell them luck had nothing to do with it. It was about knowing exactly where you stand and being willing to hold that ground, no matter who's holding the clipboard. But sometimes when I'm sitting on my porch, I wonder how many other people are out there right now, losing their homes because they dawn in Oppos. Do you have the maps to prove they're being robbed? Does the dirt really belong to the man with the deed, or just the man with the loudest lawyer? I'd love to hear what you all think. Have you ever had a fight for a piece of ground that was rightfully yours, or is the idea of, in quote, owning, in quote, anything just a polite fiction we all agree on until someone more powerful comes along? Drop a comment below, because in this world, if you dawn into Oppos, define your boundaries, someone else will do it for you.